Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Bob Sessions, retired professor of philosophy. In the news a lot lately at the legislature, but around the state, has been a topic that has been a concern actually for Iowans for some time, and that is the quality of our water, both the groundwater and the water under the ground. The Iowa legislature this year is trying to figure out how to pay for the monitoring and cleaning up of the waters in Iowa. And they've had various proposals, so there's a lot of talk about this. In 2010, Iowans passed a constitutional amendment that said that we wanted our water monitored and cleaned up. The problem was that no money was available. So a big topic in the legislature this year is how to get the money. We want to focus this morning on part of the topic, not the whole topic, it's huge. With regard to cleaning the water, we know that places like municipalities and so on that have a very specific place where the water goes into the rivers and so on, they know pretty much what's going on there, how to monitor it, what the standards are, and so on. The difficult has to do with the non-point sources, places like farms, places like stormwaters where material goes off of people's lawns and streets and so on. Those are much more difficult to monitor and to know how to clean up. And so we're going to focus our attention on that this morning. With me, we have three really qualified people to talk about this topic. To my left is David Osterberg, who works with the Iowa Policy Project. David, thank you for coming this morning.
You bet.
And Mary Skopec is next to him. She works for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Mary, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Bob.
And finally, Brad Wilson, who works on the Fireweed Farm, and he's a member of the National Family Farm Coalition. So he's a farmer, and he's, I think, going to be especially helpful in understanding what's going on the farms and why it's so difficult to figure out how to deal with that aspect of our problem. First, let's see if we can get a quick fix on what's going on in the waters, especially in the rivers and streams. What is it that's there? How does it get there? Mary, you want to take that on? You're the water person.
Sure. So when we monitor the state of Iowa, we look at streams around the state. We see that there's a lot of sediment. So the dirt that washes off farm fields ends up in our lakes and our rivers. That sediment tends to have things like phosphorus stuck onto that sediment. Phosphorus is what drives those green waters that we see, and so sometimes we have algae blooms as a result of that phosphorus. Those algae blooms sometimes can produce a toxin, and that toxin is found in our water and can be dangerous for pets as well as people, livestock, swimming, that kind of thing. And then, excuse me.
So we're seeing more and more lakes being closed down earlier and earlier in the summer.
We are. Last year we had a record number of advisories due to toxic algae blooms, and that trajectory is upward over the last 5 years. And so we expect with the warm winter that we had and moving into a pretty warm spring, that we'll have a number of those blooms again this year. Along with that, we see high levels of nitrogen. So nitrate is probably the most important contaminant that we're looking at right now in the state of Iowa. It tends to form in the soil and is moved to the stream through groundwater tiles. So these are pipes that are in farm fields to draw the water down so that the soil isn't saturated, and then that nitrate ends up in our streams, and that's a problem for drinking water as well as for aquatic life.
And of course, we have a very high-profile lawsuit on the part of the Waterworks Department in Des Moines against 3 or 4 counties north of them for that pollution. Not specific farmers, but the whole county, because it's difficult to tie down the sources, okay? So what would you propose we do to try to figure out just where this is coming from before we start talking about how we're going to prevent it from happening?
Well, in terms of knowing where it's coming from, we have a lot of data, and we've known for 30 years that tile discharge contains a lot of nitrogen. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone that tile drainage is high in nitrate, and it's delivering that to the streams. So if we have tile drainage primarily in the north central part of the state, but we do have it at other places in the state, we can start with that. that we need to look at what levels are coming out of those tiles and then how we bring that down in stepwise fashion through time.
Brad, you're a farmer, okay? What are some of the difficulties that make it problematic for the people doing the monitoring and trying to figure out the standards and so on to apply similar kinds of procedures that they have for municipalities to farms? What are the variables?
There are a lot of farms in a variety of conditions. Some are more hilly, some are more flat, and and they use different kinds of farming practices. So, and then over time, farming has changed, and so those bigger issues of how farming has changed have a lot of effect on this. We don't have the crop rotations that we used to have, for example, and we don't have the livestock on farms that we used to have. And so it kind of puts farmers in a bind of how to deal with something like this when these other forces have been changing your farming system.
Yeah. And of course, different amounts of rain at different places. One field would erode badly and have all sorts of things in the water, another one wouldn't because it had less rain and so on. So that's difficult. All right, so we know how to deal with the poisons and toxins in the water coming out of municipalities and so on. How are we going to go about dealing with the same issues on farms? Okay, we know where the problems are typically. We know how to prevent them. I think this is not rocket science. It's agricultural science. It's been around for a long time, and as Brad mentioned or suggested, we didn't used to have some of these problems. I mean, it's been getting worse and worse as we move to this new type of agriculture. So what methods might we use that we've learned in the past, or new methods that would help to reduce that?
Well, I'll jump in, and then David can jump in. So one of the challenges that we have is when we look at tiles, for example, we have more than 1 million miles of tile. So we need to look at landscape level changes. That when we look at trying to essentially put a Band-Aid on all of those millions of outlets that come from that tile into the stream, that's a challenge because the scale of doing that is immense. Just the technical ability of getting out and finding all of those tiles, you don't always know where those are in your farm field. And so I think landscape level changes really need to happen. Things like cover crops that can essentially cover the entire system and really start to deal with the water coming down, the nutrients in the soil, managing that water balance a little bit better than we've done in the past. And so that's something I think is really important, is to think about the soil as the skin of our landscape and to really take care of that soil in a much more holistic manner.
And I think that the north central part of the state, the Des Moines lobe, they did tiling in order to get rid of all these wetlands so they could farm it. I think you have to bring some of those wetlands back. Without doing that, you're not going to get that reduction. And you mentioned the Des Moines Water Works suit. What they're suing is the counties because the counties are in charge of these drainage districts. And they are an organization of farmers who all discharge to the same place. And it comes out in a pipe, just like it does in the city of Mount Vernon on our sewage treatment plant. And what Bill Stowe and the people in his organization, he's the head of Des Moines Water Works, say is it's point source, regulate it. And if you regulate it, then all of a sudden people have to start not just musing about what might happen, they have to do it. And that may be, that's one of the reasons that this has become such a big deal in Iowa. Our water's been awful dirty for an awful long time, but this seems to be the year where they want to address it.
I just added, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, what's happening in killing, as they say, the Gulf of Mexico is an issue. But also, here in Iowa, we have the surface water, the water that's draining off into our rivers and streams, but we also have our wells. And so, tile moves water instead of just soaking in maybe to your wells, it's going over to rivers. Iowa CCI did well water testing on a lot of farms during the 1990s and found nitrate is one of the things that they looked at that was a big problem that farmers are dealing with, because they were getting awareness then of how nitrates can be harmful in certain ways, harmful to babies, for example.
It's harmful to babies, it's harmful to the ecosystem. People are advised not to eat the fish, or maybe one fish a week. There's a dead zone at the end of the Mississippi. I mean, there are a lot of different effects that are coming from this. What would you say, though, about the argument that the farm people are putting out? First of all, it's difficult to know exactly where it's coming from. You know, I agree if you've got tiling, but there are other sources on a lot of fields that aren't just from tiling. You know, it's a wash off from the gullies and so on. But farmers can't afford it. Corn is at $3, $3.50 a bushel. It's hardly meeting the cost of production. They simply can't afford to do that. And so what are we going to do with that response? Because I think it's very real. A lot of farmers are just making it at best.
Right, and a few years ago when the prices were very high, the argument was, well, we got to take more land and put it into corn because this is an opportunity to make the situation worse. So when it's high prices, we can't do anything. Low prices, we can't do anything. I think we have to do something, and that's why a totally voluntary system that says for cities, you have to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus coming out of your sewage treatment plant. Do it. For farmers, voluntary. I'm not sure you can make a voluntary system work. You can, because you have an awful lot of really good farmers. They're probably doing those things that are required to do. Maybe they got cost share to do them, maybe they didn't, but they're doing them. There's a lot of people that farm really badly, and nobody wants to call them out. Other farmers don't seem to want to call them out. They know who's farming well and who's farming badly. Whoever said it was not hidden or something. You can look and figure out where that problem is coming from and do something about it. And it's not that everybody's in denial. Soybean Association is one of the organizations in Iowa that's been trying to do research, trying to look at methods, and but many of the others, like the Farm Bureau, is just in total denial. It's not our fault, not our fault. And that's what they've been saying for, I don't know, 100 years? How long they've been around? But that same notion coming out of them. Not all farm groups are like them, thank goodness.
And I think it's important, too, to think about that notion of sustainability. It's a word that I think sometimes gets used and people don't know what it means, really. But when we look at our agricultural system, things like phosphorus inputs, our phosphorus is limited. We know that if we look down that road, we will lose our phosphorus that we're mining. And so thinking about things that replenish the soil, climate change with increasing rains that are washing away, early spring rains washing away our soil and our nitrogen and our soil health, is not very sustainable. And so I think economic models that couple the water quality models are going to be helpful. So again, looking at perennial crops, looking at things that build that vitality through time. Yes, it's expensive maybe to do some of the practices, but at the same time, there's examples of farmers out there who are farming without inputs because they're using their manure, they're building that soil health through cover crops and other things. So I think long-term sustainability, economic and environmental, will come through some of these practices.
And you talk about a 5-year or 4-year rotation.
Crop rotations.
Yeah, not just corn, corn, or corn, beans, but other crops.
There are a lot of things that could be done differently in farming systems, such as the crop rotation where you don't have it in row crops as much, and you know, hogs even can be fed a lot on alfalfa. You know, maybe a third of their diet could be. There's a lot known on the sustainability side, but you know, I would like to just step back a minute and folks, I'm glad this is on ethical perspectives here, because there's a basic issue of justice here. So often I find that this is approached from a sustainability point of view without enough focus on the justice side. And so in the past 60 years, we've had, we started with a farm bill that had a parity price, basically a living wage farm price, with a price floor, you know, no need for any subsidies. And through the pressure of big corporations, they lowered the price floor down, and eliminated it. And the farm prices have come way down to only less than a third of what they were. And in the process, it ran most farmers out of business, and the surviving farmers have mostly lost their livestock because the cheap prices subsidized the loss of livestock to CAFOs, to the animal confinement systems. And those, by the way, are owned by just 4 corporations, own 2/3 of all hogs in the United States. So it's just an extreme issue of justice that then, without livestock, what are you going to use the alfalfa or clover for? And so how can you have that crop rotation economically if you don't have the basic justice? You know, this is a farmer's ethics, really. You know, if you go back through history, is an ethics of justice, because for the past 5,000 years, you know, first we had the agricultural revolution, but then we had the urban revolution with the civilization and the big power complex. And, you know, they pretty much defined through history the peasant as someone exploited. You know, up to their neck in water where just a ripple might drown them, is one of the comments used. And that's a part of that's also part of the religious ethics. You know, when you're under those kinds of pressures, when most of you have been run out of business, it's easy to get mad at each other, to be divided. And when you, since we've lost in the Farm Bill, it's kind of interesting because that's the opposite of the public perception, which is that farmers have won on the Farm Bill, and that's what the problem is. So we have a misunderstanding of what the politics is also in this way.
Well, let me go back to my economic concern, though. I mean, in a town or a city, you've got thousands, hundreds of thousands of people paying for that water treatment plant, okay?
Yes.
On a farm, you've got this 3,000 acres, let's say, and you've got a couple people, okay? And yes, they have a big operation, but they've got, you know, lots of expenses, and how can they afford to pay what it's going to take? I mean, it really is going to take quite a bit to change these farming methods, and perhaps even to change away from corn and beans, which some people are suggesting we need to do.
Well, there are other things to do, and most of them are expensive. And what cost share has done, and that's pretty much tradition in most states, including Iowa, is that when you put in something like a buffer along the stream, which will certainly help the phosphorus, although maybe not the nitrogen, 50-foot buffer along streams can do a whole lot towards water quality. And it's fair that citizens, just regular folks like us, pay for part of that. And that's a tradition. There's still money that you have to pick up on the other end, that's true. But there are places to go for this money. I mean, when I went down to Ace Hardware not long ago and bought some fertilizer, 10-10-10 fertilizer used in a garden, I paid tax on it. Farmer pays no tax whatsoever on nitrogen fertilizer, except for a tiny, tiny little thing that we put in when I was a legislator to fund the Leopold Center. That is a lot of money, and I'm not sure it comes from farmers or from the corporations making the fertilizer. It's kind of hard to find what the incidence is. But taking that money and putting it back through the system is one way if you find some money to do something about this. It's going to take some money.
Joe Bolcom, the legislator from Iowa City, I believe, Joe Bolcom, he mentioned, you know, hey, people asking, if the problem is on farms, should we be taxed to fix what's on farms? You know, but the missing piece, the justice piece, is that farm prices have been reduced so much that over these years, you know, the price of corn for most of the years since 1981 has been below the full cost of production, and soybeans also, and all of those major crops. And so farmers, in a sense, have been subsidizing the public over these years, and yet through the corporations that pay the price for it. So as this going down, 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 and then losing your ability, your economic reasons for having these better systems, then you end up getting the blame and saying, why don't you pay for it? It's your problem. So we need a bigger thing. Now the Farm Bill itself is a market management system that takes land out of production. When you have a Farm Bill, it was basically ended in 1996, 20 years ago, but a Farm Bill can manage this kind of an issue, and it can help farmers get a fair price at the same time it requires them to meet tougher and tougher standards. We need something big to fix this. This is a huge problem, but it has to be fixed in a way that pays farmers a fair price at the same time that more demands are made. To just simply say we need to make more demands on farmers and not even know of the injustices that have happened over these decades, that's going to be a problem.
So Brad, let me maybe put this in a little bit different terms and see if I'm getting it right. it's not as if farmers have been out there as lone rangers, autonomous economic units. They're part of this larger system, and the system is one in which we're all involved. Okay, people in the past worked that land and created, farmland and so on. People in the current world benefit from it. People in the future are going to need it. Okay, so it's a public resource that they're helping to manage, and we're helping them supposedly through farm bills and other things to be able to do what they need to do in order to produce the food we need. Okay, but it's not like they're out there all alone. We've got this system, and the problem is the system hasn't been taking seriously two things. One, our responsibility to farmers, and on the other hand, farmers' responsibilities to us. Is that a fair way of putting it?
They have to go together. They have to go together. The original Farm Bill design was to have farmers not get paid too much with a price ceiling and reserve supplies, and also not be paid too little with a price floor and supply reductions as needed. And those supply reduction programs could be used in much more powerful environmental ways. I don't see that politically farmers are going to have a tough time dealing with this huge crisis, especially with so little awareness of the Farm Bill, and with this perception that it's been a support for farmers. So farmers have actually gotten less and less and less and less and less money over 60 years.
It seems that the part of the issue, though, is we lack diversity in our agricultural system. So it's a corn bean universe right now. And so we need to think about, and more than 60% of our corn has gone to ethanol. So it's not even a food product so much. But looking at diversity of systems, perennial crops, crops that can be grown for local consumption and actual food production, those actually end up being more economically valuable to the farmer, but we don't have the outlets for those. So if you grow nuts in Iowa, where do you sell them? Where do you sell your fruit crops? So we lack those systems, and I think that's some of the support that could be brought into the system as well to help people move away from this just traditional corn bean agriculture, which we've spent a lot of time and effort trying to make up new uses for that stuff, corn sweeteners and so forth.
And so, those haven't been particularly good for us.
And they haven't. And so looking at an agricultural system that has driven farmers into this, kind of two-crop system, and kind of backing away and saying, what is a long-term food crop that could perhaps be better for Iowa in the foreseeable future?
David, maybe you can bring us up to date on the political wrangling that's going on about, okay, how do we pay for some of this assistance that we've been asking for some time?
Well, there are several proposals. The governor had a proposal this year that he would take money essentially from, the way it was characterized, he's taken money from schools to put it into water quality. And as soon as that is the way it was characterized, it had no chance. Had no chance with either Democrats or Republicans. Joe Bolcom, whose name has been mentioned, a state senator from Iowa City, thinks that a checkoff, that farmers would voluntarily put money into a system through the same checkoff that they voluntarily put money into marketing their crops. One of the new plans, and I think that was on Tuesday of this week, that the House Republicans are now taking money away from infrastructure and putting it in there. But they're always taking money away from something, because somebody has to say this: Republicans will not raise any taxes even though we have a big issue. They always have to take it from some other place. That's why I'm not very optimistic that we're going to do much, as long as you have that attitude. And plus that, you give more and more tax breaks, so the amount of money that comes into the budget has been going down. We need to deal with this. Iowans already said that they wanted to take 3/8 of a penny and put it into this stuff. Put it in the Constitution. Somebody needs to pass a law that says that.
Mary, your thoughts on?
Well, I think that 3/8 of a cent sales tax would go a long ways toward providing cost share for the practices, for set-aside lands. It was overwhelmingly passed by the citizens of Iowa, who thought that they were actually raising that tax. And so I think that there's a lot of support on both sides of the aisle to get that done, because there's a lot of need for that money, and farmers need support to try new things. There's a lot of money that goes into buying new equipment if you want to add on a new system. So I think supporting that through the sales tax seems like a logical thing to do, and Iowans supported it.
The marketplace can pay for a lot of this. if you manage that marketplace. I believe in both state and federal. I think that there's a lot of things being proposed, a lot of good ideas coming out at the state level. I think that's great, that's important. I mean, one thing on the state level is we have done things to help the big animal confinement units that have taken the livestock away and that have therefore hurt crop rotations, okay? That should be reversed, I think. And that's something that you wouldn't maybe think of as the first line, but that's a huge thing. The marketplace. Nicholas Johnson mentioned, he threw out a number of $1 trillion, when you think about big things. Well, what has been taken away from farmers in the United States is in the trillions since 1952, when they started lowering the price floor down, and running the farmers out of business. So the marketplace the public doesn't know that the farmers have not been making money, that they've been run out of business by this program, that the Farm Bill didn't support them. And so the marketplace can pay for it. You raise that price up, and there's plenty of money. And you don't have to write any government checks to do it. And you can have rules that bring livestock back to set aside land even, things that haven't been done before if you have this big of a problem. And, climate change is the same kind of a thing. The things that put carbon in the soil are similar to the ones for water. Okay. Justice and sustainability together.
So, Brad, you've been talking quite a bit about ethics, which is what this program is about. Give you each a minute, because that's all the time we have. In a minute, tell us what you think the major ethical issue or issues are with this topic and how you might address them. I know that's a tall order in 1 minute, but let's try it. David, you want to start?
Well, I think we go back to sustainability. You have to look at what's going to work for the very long time. So you're talking about future generations having the kind of soils that we have right now. And your program has to be, in that sense, be considered not just how we're all doing, but how future generations do. And that has to be incorporated into all of this stuff.
And I would just add to that it's a shared responsibility, so that we can't just assume the government's taking care of that or farmers are taking care of that we all need to think about taking care of the water. What can we do, either through advocating policy or on our own property, and really working toward that shared responsibility, because it isn't in just one group's hands alone. And all Iowans really need to come together and support a better water quality vision for the state.
I work a lot with social movements, various sectors, and that's a part of how you can win it and the politics of it. But you need this, from my point of view, we need a much better understanding of the justice of the issues, distributive economic justice in things like the Farm Bill, to deal with these political issues and the spending issues that are otherwise, how do you solve them? And they're really tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. One thing we haven't touched at all is the animal side of this. You didn't mention how the CAFOs also are contributing to water pollution, both in wells and rivers and so on. But we'll have to leave that for another time. So thank you, David Osterberg and Mary Skopec and Brad Wilson, for joining us this morning. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, good work. Goes fast.
It does.